Hi everyone, welcome back. So today's lecture, we're going to be talking about evolution and natural selection. And we had a discussion recently about biotechnology. That was last week. We talked about biotechnology, and I thought this slide was really interesting. I wanted to share it with you in relationship to all of the biotechnology changes that we're able to make. And MIT Technology Review had this as their headline, $2 million would save her life. Could you pay? Should you? And one of the ethical dilemmas that we have, that we're facing as a society, is that we risk creating a society where some groups, because of culture or geography or poverty, may end up bearing a greater burden of genetic disease because perhaps they can't pay or have access to some of these huge technological changes that we're able to bring about with science. So let's get into evolution and natural selection. I really love this image because can you spot the target of the owl? What the owl is going after? So he's going after this mouse right here. There's actually a mouse on this stump, and he is very nicely camouflaged. You can see that his fur blends very well with the stump that he's attempting to hide on. And we're going to talk about why that is. Also, when we take a look at this butterfly here, maybe a moth, we can see that the head is here to the right. Obviously, we know that because we can see antenna and we see the head and we see the legs here, and that gives us some context. However, he's got this false eye here. And this false eye, he's evolved and adapted to have, because if a predator comes along, the predator in an instant may actually grab this false eye, thinking it's the head, and give this insect, this butterfly, this moth, the opportunity to fly away and live another day. So that's evolution and natural selection. Now, in the lab, this little guy is actually the workhorse of the lab. This is a fruit fly, the common fruit fly. If you leave an apple or if you leave a banana out on your counter in the kitchen, you probably know this guy very well. You're going to see fruit flies flying around not too long after leaving something out. But we use the fruit fly in the laboratory to run a lot of experiments. And so there was this really interesting experiment that was done. And the question of the experiment was, can we cause a fruit fly to evolve such that it can survive starvation? And the real question was, can we, as humans, cause another organism to evolve? Okay, so let's look at the experiment. So here we have on our y-axis the number of flies, the number of fruit flies, and then we have the hours until death from starvation, and the average fruit fly can survive about 20 hours without food. Okay, so that's good to know when you leave things on your counter. And so here's how the experiment was run. The initial setup. They started with a cage that contains a large number of fruit flies, about 5,000, and then they removed the food. And they waited until 80% of the flies starved to death, and then they returned the food to the cage to the remaining flies, the remaining fruit flies, and they recorded the average starvation resistance time, how long they were able to resist starvation. Now, these flies that survived each round of starvation, they were allowed to go on and reproduce and lay eggs. So only the most starvation resistant flies were allowed to live to lay eggs. And so they were basically starting this next generation after surviving starvation. So After the surviving flies, they ate a bit, and then they laid their eggs, and those eggs were collected, and that generation from the collected eggs was the next generation that went into the next round of this remove the food, wait until 80% die, and then put it back. And what happened was, over many generations of natural selection, the population actually changed. The original fruit flies, they couldn't survive a day without food. Their average lifespan was 20 hours. No food, they were going to die in 20 hours. But as this experiment went on with each round of selection, starving for the most starvation resistant, selecting for the most starvation resistant fruit flies, it turns out that in the end, the last generation that they finished the experiment with, they could actually survive almost an entire week without food, which is amazing. So the fruit flies were able to evolve through this forced evolution from a 20-hour starvation survival to 160-hour starvation resistance, which was amazing. And so this experiment actually showed that we can, through manipulation, cause another species to evolve. I love the image of this little guy because this is one of the iguanas that's on the Galapagos Islands, and it just looks like he has a big smile on his face. So I really like his image and his eyes. But that leads us, the Galapagos Islands leads us to a theory that most people who have not taken biology have a misunderstanding of, and this is Darwin's theory of evolution, the theory that he described in his publication, The Origin of Species. And most people, the layperson who hasn't taken biology or science of any kind, they think that evolution has something to do with religion, and it doesn't. If you have religion, you could keep whatever religious belief you have, because evolution does not actually in any way cross with religion. So in science and religion, they're two very separate things. So religion deals with belief, right? And you're free to believe whatever it is you want to believe. And science is all about data and looking at what we can measure. And what the theory of evolution really is it's just about the change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. That's it. That is the theory of evolution. So let's dig into it a little bit more. So before Darwin's theory of evolution, mankind thought that all organisms were put on Earth by a creator all at the same time. Poof, they all, appeared. They were all there at the same time. And they thought that organisms are all fixed. There are no additions. There are no new organisms. There are no subtractions. They didn't think there was extinction at all. They thought the Earth was about 6,000 years old, and they thought the Earth was mostly unchanging. Now, Darwin's theory was first published in 1859, and after his theory, we understood that organisms do change over time, that some organisms have gone extinct. They don't exist anymore, that the Earth is actually more than 6,000 years old, and the geology of Earth is not constant, but it's always changing. And so that's what this theory has brought about. And so Darwin didn't just come up with this theory out of the ether. He had some influences, right? So he was reading the works, as there always is in science. When you publish, it's so that other scientists can read the work and kind of build on it, right? So he was reading the works of the likes of George Buffington, who was suggesting that the Earth was much older than previously believed. He felt it was older than 6,000 years. He was reading the works of George Cuvier, who was documenting fossil discoveries, and he was showing that extinction had actually occurred. He was reading the works of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, suggesting that living species might change over time, that they're not just static. And he was reading the works of Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell was suggesting that he was arguing that geological forces had gradually shaped the earth and was continuing to do so. Okay, so those were his influences, Darwin's influences. And so when we look at, I mean, it seems just very intuitive to us now, like, of course, that there are species that have gone extinct, right? Because we have the fossil record, and they didn't know that back then, and this theory basically helped to bring that to light. We have found fossils of mastodons. When we look at size, relative size, so you can get an idea, here we have the average person, a little over 5 feet tall, almost 6 feet tall. We can see that the mastodon stood nearly 10 feet tall. Same thing for the Irish elk, which is also extinct, that stood almost 10 feet tall with the antlers, and the giant ground sloth that, again, was nearly 7 feet tall. And these are all extinct, but we have the fossil record to tell us that they actually existed. And so Darwin actually started his journey around the world. And if you know, I'm always telling you that the backstory of science is really fascinating. And Darwin's backstory is one of those backstories that's truly fascinating. If you want to read a biography, or even just go to the Wikipedia page on Darwin, it's really interesting because he actually was the son of a doctor, and his father wanted him to become a doctor as well. And back then, surgery wasn't the greatest experience because there weren't a lot of anesthetics that were invented yet. And so it was rather gruesome. And so they would have these operating theaters where literally the medical students, would sit at the very top of this round arena, and at the bottom of the arena they would have the operating table with the patient on it, and then the students, were watching the operation. And of course, back then they were using, saws and chisels and very little anesthesia, and what anesthesia they had was really not that effective to actually truly have the person go unconscious, and it was not easy to watch. And of course, Darwin sat in on one of those, and from then on he was like, I am not going to become a doctor. And his father was very upset about that, and he said, well, if you're not going to become a doctor, you have to make something of yourself, and so you're going to become basically like the steward to the ship's captain of this voyage that was going around the world on this ship. So his father set up for him to be the person who, lays out the clothing and polishes the shoes of the captain on this voyage. And it turned out to be life-changing, not only for Darwin, but also for the rest of the world. And so we can see here the actual voyage. They started here in England, and they essentially circumnavigated the globe, but it was the stop here in the Galapagos Islands that changed everything. So here, what we can see in this round the world voyage that he set off on, we have a look at the Galapagos Islands, and they are preserved and conserved today because they are so special. So what happened? So it's all about observation, right? Remember when we were studying the scientific method, it all starts with an observation, right? And what Darwin observed was he took a look at the finches, the birds that were there, both on the mainland of Ecuador and also in the Galapagos Islands. And although the finches found on the Galapagos Islands had slightly different physical characteristics, they still resembled the single mainland finch that he saw. And he started to wonder about that. Why do they look so similar, but yet, the beaks are different? And then here, around the world, he started to notice that there's this striking similarity between the fossils of these extinct species and the living species in that same area. So here we have the hairy armadillo, which is alive today, and then we have this Glyptodont, which is like 10 feet, in length, that is extinct, but very much resembles the very small but currently alive hairy armadillo. And so that's where it all began, making these observations. And so it turns out that throughout this voyage, Darwin had prepared this 35-page draft, and he placed it in a drawer for 14 years, right? And this, when I read this discovery, Darwin's whole biography is completely different than what the notion that I had in my head from what I knew of him. So number one, knowing that, his father was disappointed that he didn't become a doctor. I mean, everyone can relate to that, where maybe your parents want you to become something and you want to become something different, but it turns out that, it all turns out okay, when you follow your own calling. And so, because I was under the impression that, he wanted to go on this voyage and, so that he can make these discoveries, right? And no, it was happenstance that put him there. And so many things, so many huge discoveries in science are the end result of these happy accidents that happen, right? But even after this voyage, and even after making these observations and documenting everything and writing this draft, he placed it in a drawer for 14 years. And here's some of the reasons, why. So in science, when you come up with something that is paradigm shifting, that completely changes the way the whole world thinks about a concept or even a series of concepts, it's not like the world embraces you and says, oh, it's so wonderful, right? No, they all pile on to try to disprove it. And basically, it can be a lot to take. It can be very daunting. And he wasn't ready for that. So he put it in a drawer for 14 years and didn't really want to let the scientific community know about his observations and his thoughts behind it. But then this guy right here, Alfred Wallace sent him a description of evolution by natural selection, which he had written. And Wallace was suffering from a disease that he had picked up in the jungle, and he was not able to make it back in order to publish, his theory of evolution by natural selection. And so he sent it to Darwin and said, I'm very sick. Can you please present this to the Linnaean Society of London, the big science society? Can you present this for me? And of course, Darwin read it and, discovered that it was the same thing that he had come up with. So at the same time, they had come to the same conclusion. But it turns out that Darwin did the right thing. He did a joint presentation to the Linnaean Society of London, and he basically both were credited for the first description of evolution by natural selection. And evolution, is the change of allele frequencies in a population over time due to natural selection here. And so Wallace, for a long time, was lost to history because, you know, he didn't make it out of the jungle to tell the story to the Linnaean Society. It was Darwin who stood up and did the presentation for both of them. And of course, then Darwin got all of the fame and everything that went along with it. But now we are going back in history and we're pulling out those who were done a disservice by not being given all the credit that they deserve for what they also discovered. So here is Alfred Wallace, who also is credited for the first description of evolution by natural selection, in addition to Charles Darwin. So let's look at what this is. What is this evolution of populations? So, you know, I just told you that the definition of evolution, which I'm going to hammer over and over to make sure it's in your brain and that you're not stuck with the layman's definition of evolution. The definition of evolution is the change of allele frequency in a population over time. And let's look at how this can happen. So remember, alleles are different variations for a trait, right? When I have, say, a flower and it has petals, and maybe there are different alleles for different petal colors, right? So I have the gene for the color of a petal. However, there are different alleles, different variations of that gene that have different colors, okay? So remember your definition of alleles. So here we have, we were just looking at those tigers, right? Let's just go back to that image of the tigers. Here we have the regular tiger coloration that we're used to, the sort of orange on black, and then here we have an albino tiger. All right, so in this orange color, we have the proportion of orange fur pigment alleles in the population, right? When we look at this pie chart. And then we have this gray sliver, the small gray sliver, which is the proportion of white fur pigment alleles in the population of tigers. Now, evolution, as I said before, is a change in the allele frequencies of a population over time. So, for example, we can have this change in the proportion of pigment alleles in the population of tigers. When that happens, it means that evolution has occurred. So when we look at the pie chart, here we have this larger swath of orange fur pigment in the tiger population, this very small swath of white fur pigment alleles in that whole population. Over time, something has occurred where we get this greater and greater proportion of white fur pigment in tigers. And when that happens, when we get this change in allele frequency of a population over time, that means that evolution has occurred. Okay, that is the definition of evolution. And so the question is, well, what can cause this change in allele frequency? Well, there are lots of things that can actually cause that. So we'll look at a few. So you can have a mutation, this alteration of the base pair sequences in the DNA of an individual's gamete-producing cells that will change an allele's frequency. You can have something called genetic drift. Genetic drift is this random change in allele frequencies that can occur, and it's unrelated to any allele's influence on reproductive success. And we deal with genetic drift a lot in the laboratory because we have these cells that are a cell line. Remember the cell lines that we talked about with cancer. And as we basically are plating them up, because they're immortal, they'll live forever as we continue to put them on new plates. As we plate them up, we have to be careful because we can start to see genetic drift over time. And it's just these random changes that actually are changing the entire cell line over time. So what we do is in the lab, we only, after 6 plates of cells, that's as far as we will go because we know we're going to start to see genetic drift. and we have to go back and open up, another container of the original to do further experiments. We won't go past 6 generations of us replating the cells in the lab, because we're going to see genetic drift, and we're not dealing with the same cells now, right? So what else can cause evolution? So migration, this a change in allele frequency caused by individuals moving into or out of a population, and of course natural selection. This change in allele frequency that occurs when individuals with one version of a heritable trait have a greater reproductive success than individuals with a different version of the trait. And we're going to look closer at what that means. So let's take a look at an evolutionary change due to a mutation. So mutations can cause evolution when an alteration of the base pair sequence in the DNA of an individual's gamete-producing cells, and it has to be the gamete-producing cells, right? Because it doesn't matter if it's your liver cell or your skin cell, your eye cell, or whatever, you're not passing that on to the next generation. But when this alteration, this mutation happens in your gametes, well, that's going to the next generation, right? So here, we're looking at what is the American curl mutation in cats, which results in curled ears. So here we have the normal base pair sequence that results in this normal protein, which results in ears that look like this cat on the left, right? But if we have this mutation, this mutagen that has mutated the base pair sequence in that gene sequence, we end up with a very different protein, right? So we had a point mutation here, and so that change in protein results in curly ears in the cat, right? And so that can be an evolutionary change. Genetic drift, I just talked to you about a example of that in the lab where we're working with different cancer cells, and if we plate them out past 6 different plates over time, we're going to see genetic drift just due to random mutations. And here it's just showing the same thing with a cleft in the chin in people. And this is looking a little bit deeper into the chin cleft and how that can happen. So for example, here you have genetic drift causing evolution when an allele's frequency changes for any of several reasons that are unrelated to the allele's influence on reproductive success. So you've got this population before genetic drift, and here in blue we have the percent of the population that has a cleft chin, and this turns out to be a dominant gene. And then in this greenish color here, we've got the percent of the population that has a smooth chin, and it turns out this is a recessive gene. Now, neither allele is related to reproductive success, so inheritance is based solely on chance. Now, in this example, we have this heterozygous couple, so it's heterozygous, which means they have the individuals have one of each gene, right? Could have 2 children that are homozygous recessive, causing an increase in the proportion of recessive alleles in the population, right? Because now we're starting to see more of the recessive alleles. And so we can get this population after the genetic drift has happened. So there are now more recessive alleles in the population than there were before, right? And it just happened because this couple, and this is going to happen to multiple couples in a population, not just one, right? But suddenly we see an increase in the frequency of this change in chin shape because of that. So let's look at a term called fixation, what that is, because you can get a gene that is fixed in a population. So fixation is when genetic drift leads to this fixation of an allele's frequency, when it becomes 100% in a population, as we can see. Remember, we had the heterozygous, right? And then we had the homozygous recessive in this green, and as the homozygous recessive increases in the population, and when homozygous recessive becomes the only gene allele that is in the population, now it's fixed, right? Because you can't get any other variation, because there is no other variation. It is the population, the entire population is completely homozygous recessive, and that's called fixation. Okay. We can also get something called the founder effect. And it turns out what I'm showing you here is polydactylism, which is extra digits. You've probably seen this in cats where you have the six-toed cats. They're supposed to be lucky, right? But there are lots of people who are born with 6 fingers on one hand, and typically when they're born, we remove the extra digit wherever it may be. Here on this individual, it's actually coming off the thumb, so there's surgery to actually remove that. Some people, they have it over here on the other side of the pinky, and there's surgery to remove that when they're still infants. And that's because, not that it's causing them a functional problem, it's causing them a problem in society, right? And so they may be treated differently in society, and we don't want that. And so the digit is removed. Now, of course, that's not going to change this individual potentially passing down that gene to their offspring, right? And so from there on, the other offspring have to deal with it as well. So let's look at the founder effect. So genetic drift occurs via the founder effect when the founding members of a new population have different allele frequencies than the original source population. All right, let's break that down. So here you have the original source population, and the original source population has 5 digits per hand, and that's a recessive gene to have 5 digits, for example. And here we have this very small slice of that original population that had more than 5 digits per hand. And that more than 5 digit gene turns out to be a dominant gene. Now, if this little slice, this little group of individuals packs up and leaves and founds a new population, they're just like, we're going to move to island X, right? Well, now when we look at that new population, suddenly we're going to see this change, right? Because if the allele frequencies for a specific gene differ among a population's founders relative to the source population, then this trait, such as polydactylism, may be disproportionately frequent in the new population, right? Because there's this group of individuals is all interbreeding, right? And so this dominant allele is going to become more frequent in relationship to the proportions that we see from the original source population. So that's called the founder effect. Okay? But we also have something called the bottleneck effect. And so what is that? So this is when genetic drift occurs via this effect due to things such as famine, disease, or rapid environmental change that causes the death of a large random proportion of the population. And then the surviving individuals end up having different allele frequencies than the original population. So let's take a closer look at that. So here we have the original population, and here we have all these different allele frequencies in that population, right? And then we have this extreme effect, right, that caused the death of this huge portion of the population. And those that survive have now this different allele frequency. You can see now, say the purple gene is gone, the yellow gene is gone, right? They were wiped out during this extreme event. And so this is called the bottleneck. And so this surviving population, this new population, is going to be dominated by the genetic features present in the surviving members. So it's really just common sense, right? You have all these different alleles that were present, then you have this catastrophic event, and really the surviving population just has the genes of those who survived. It has a name. It's called the bottleneck effect. Okay? And we see that today in cheetahs. So it turns out that all cheetahs living today can actually trace their ancestry back to a dozen or so individuals that happen to survive a population bottleneck that occurred about 10,000 years ago. And so that puts cheetahs in a very delicate position in survival, right? Because they can all trace their ancestry back to a dozen or so individuals. We don't have as much variety and diversity in the alleles in that population. And that means that if we have a disease that comes through, it could potentially wipe out all the cheetahs because there's not as much diversity in their population because of this bottleneck effect that happened about 10,000 years ago. So very, very delicate species. Okay, I want to share with you this paper that came out in Nature in October of 2018. And this was a really fascinating paper because it was one of the first papers that showed that gut microbes, the bacteria that are in our gut microbes can actually alter metabolic activity, walking activity. And this was shown in our laboratory organism, the fruit fly. And the paper basically describes how these gut microbes can actually alter the walking activity of fruit flies. And here's what they showed, that there's this Lactobacillus brevis that when it's present in the fruit fly, here we have this downregulation of this, basically a sugar called trehalose. And that trehalose actually has an effect on the neurons in the brain. And so you end up having this lower activity of neurons in the brain. And so they looked at the walking behavior of the fruit fly, right? And they basically traced the walking path. And so the fruit fly with this natural gut microbe here, this Lactobacillus brevis, this is how much they walked, right? But then when they wiped out specifically that lactobacillus, suddenly this is how much the fruit fly walked, which is an extraordinarily high amount of time as compared to the one with the gut bacteria present. And so this was sort of an eye-opening experiment because we never thought before that the microbes in our gut could be influencing the amount of activity that we have, right? The amount of exercise that we get, the amount of movement that we do. And of course, this is in the fruit fly, but studies are now going on to determine whether or not, this is actually happening in us as well. And there are some very interesting studies that are starting to point in that direction, that our gut microbes may be doing more than we think they are. So they definitely are modulating our immune system. They are having a huge effect on our weight. That's been shown also when we are drinking these diet sodas, because there was sort of this dichotomy of, why is it that people who drink a lot of diet sodas seem to, really be overweight? That it seems that if you're drinking the diet sodas, you should have less weight. But it turns out there is different sugars that are in the diet sodas that are feeding a different class of microbe that actually cause you to put on more fat. And that was a very interesting study. And so these gut microbes are doing a lot more than we think they're doing to modulate us and what we do. So interesting studies going on. All right, so back to evolution. So let's look at, because we're looking at, what can cause evolution to happen? What can cause this change in allele frequency in a population over time to happen? And now we're at migration. And this is also called gene flow. And so, so this gene flow can happen and it can cause evolution if individuals move from one population to another, causing this change in allele frequency in either population. So here we've got a mountain range here, and we've got two populations of the same species existing in separate locations, right? Population 1 here on the left and population 2 here on the right. And so in this example, they're separated by a mountain range, and you can see the allele frequencies here outlined in color, and they're very, very different in these two populations. But when a group of individuals from population 1, for example, picks up and migrates over the mountain range to go join population 2, then suddenly the migrating individuals are able to survive and reproduce after the migration, and they're causing this change in allele frequency in both populations. So we get a change in the allele frequency in the population that they joined, but also you have a change in the allele frequency in the population of which they left. Okay. So in summary, when we talk about natural selection causes evolution as individuals with one version of a heritable trait have greater reproductive success than individuals with a different version of the trait, right? And so in order for this to happen, number one, you have to have different versions of the trait. Okay, that's just common sense, right? So you have to have variations for a trait. Number two, it has to be heritable. So these different versions of the trait have to be passed down from parent to offspring. It's not like this version is just happening to this one individual, right? It has to be able to be passed down to the offspring. And then what we see is that individuals with a version of a trait most suited to reproduction in their environment generally leave more offspring than individuals with other versions of the trait, right? And that is natural selection. So natural selection is when these three conditions are satisfied, the population's allele frequencies change, and consequently, evolution by natural selection occurs. So let's look closer at that. So we can see this when we look at litters of dogs. So if you've ever raised a litter of puppies, what you'll notice is oftentimes there is one puppy called the runt, who is the tiniest dog in the litter, and this individual has this what's called reduced differential reproductive success as compared to its more robust siblings, because they are preventing this little runt from having access to food that it needs to grow and thrive. So it may not make it to go on to reproduce, right? So it turns out that in a litter, when they're born, all the puppies actually pick their position, and the richest milk is the one here by the hind leg. And so the most robust puppy, that will be that puppy's position, and they do not change positions. And so, for example, here, it looks like this mother may have more puppies than she actually has the ability to feed. So this runt, if a person didn't intervene, probably wouldn't make it. And so that is going to cause a reduced differential reproductive success for this individual. And so that's selecting for individuals that are stronger and more robust, because this one, who is thinner and weaker, isn't going to go on to pass those thinner and weaker genes on to the next generation, right? We also see natural selection here in nature. So for example, here we've got these rabbits. Let's call them jackrabbits. So if we're looking at, say, this trait that causes a variation in running speed in rabbits, and it can vary from individual to the next. So just based on color, let's just say this teal one has a allele that allows them to run really fast, and this greenish one has an allele that allows them to run moderately fast, and this yellowish one has an allele that really makes them slow. So if this trait has to be heritable, right, so you have to have a variation for a trait. When we're talking natural selection, there has to be variation of that trait. There has to be different alleles. They have to be heritable, so they have to be passed down to the offspring, which we can see here that when we have the yellow allele, then the offspring also have that same slow running yellow allele. Same thing with the green allele. The offspring also have this moderate speed running green allele. And the teal color allele, the offspring also have the super fast running teal allele. Now, there has to be this differential reproductive success. So in this population, rabbits with slower running speeds, they're going to be eaten by the predators, by the fox. And their traits are not passed on to the next generation. So the fox is basically going to wipe out the yellow allele and the green allele. And which allele is going to get to go on? The teal allele, the one that can allow the rabbit to run the fastest. And so that's evolution, change in allele frequency in a population over time due to natural selection. Okay? All right. So there is a calculation that can be used that you need to know of that I will never ask you to calculate. But you just need to know when someone says the word Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, you need to know what it is. But I will never ask you to calculate it. Okay. So as long as there is random mating and no evolution, then the frequencies of recessive alleles and dominant alleles will not change over time. And that is validated by this mathematical expression called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay? And it just means that, and it just shows, it just validates that as long as there is random mating and there is no evolution, which means they're in a lab, basically, then the frequencies of recessive alleles and dominant alleles aren't going to change over time. Okay, so let's talk about fitness and habitat. As we can see, this little seal is very well adapted to its environment. We can see that its coat color helps it blend in with the environment. And so when we look at, this is really important, when we look at fitness and habitat, what we have to be very careful of is that we don't say that a certain allele is a better allele, right? Because it is only a better allele based on the environment that organism is in. If you put that same allele in a different environment, that may be an extremely detrimental allele. So let's look at an illustration of that. So here we have two mice, and here we have two different environments, right? We have a lighter color environment as a background, and we have a darker color environment as a background. Now we can see that in this lighter habitat, the allele for the light color fur is fitter, and it's going to increase in frequency. Why? Because the mice with the darker color fur are going to be easily seen by predators. They're going to be picked off. That allele is going to slowly be removed from the environment, right, as this one is eaten. So you have to be careful that you don't say that this lighter color fur allele is a fitter and better allele, because you take that same lighter color allele and you put it in a different environment with a darker background, and now it's the one that's going to be picked off and eaten by the predators. And the organism, the individual with the darker color fur, is going to go on to become the greater proportion of the population. So when it comes to genes, when it comes to alleles, it has to do with the environment, right? That they're really, you can't say that one allele is better than the other. It has to do with the environment that the organism is in. And you put it in a different environment, and that allele can be a detriment. All right, so be careful with how you talk about alleles, right? So let's take a look at Galapagos finches, the birds, and food supply, and how that relates to beak size. So along the same lines, here's what's really interesting. Adaptation does not march towards an optimal endpoint. Okay? So here, what we're seeing is the average beak size within a population continues to fluctuate according to food supply. So here on our y-axis, we have the average beak size in millimeters, and then we have years, right? From 76 all the way to 1984, and we can see that there were droughts happening here, and then we had this unusually wet year. Well, it turns out in dry years, the finches had to eat these large, really hard seeds, and so the bigger beaks were being selected for. You were starting to see more birds with larger beaks. But in the wet years, the finches could eat these small, soft seeds, and then suddenly the smaller beaks were being selected for. And so you cannot say that adaptation is marching towards this optimal endpoint. It's actually changing with the environmental changes that are happening as well. Okay? But as always, with knowledge, we try to use it to change organisms for our benefit, and we have certainly done that with the cow and several or the other organisms. With the cow, we've selected for cows with larger udders in order to produce more milk because we like to drink milk, and so we want cows that can make more milk. And if you look at a commercial dairy cow, their udders are so large that for many of them it's difficult for them to walk great distances. So we have to be very careful that we don't, select for such a large udder that now the cow can't walk at all, right? So we have to be very careful. We've done the same thing with farm turkeys. So this proportion of individual in the population here on our Y, the relative size of breast muscle in farm turkeys, because that's what we like to eat for Thanksgiving is the turkey breast, right? And what we see is that here's the smaller turkey breast, here's the larger turkey breast over here to the right. We see that farmers started to select against turkeys with smaller breasts muscles because they're less valuable, right? If you go to the store and you see this turkey and it's got this teeny tiny concave breast with very little meat, you're not going to buy it, right? And so the farmers started to select against that, and they started to select for turkeys that had much, much larger breast size, right? So this is now the population before the selection. They started selecting, and now here's the population after the selective breeding, and now they have these much larger turkey breasts. Well, they kind of went to the extreme because now turkeys on poultry farms can no longer naturally mate because the breast muscles have become so large that they have to be artificially inseminated. Did you know that? That's kind of, yeah. This is what a wild turkey looks like. And it's really cool because if you go up to places like, say, Davis, California, Northern California, there are lots of wild turkeys that are just flying around, hanging around. They're everywhere. They're very thin. They can fly. And our commercial turkeys, all they can do is waddle, right? Huge change due to selective pressures. But we have had selective pressures as well. And so here we have an individual baby. This is human baby. And there's something called stabilizing selection. And we can see the weight here of this baby is 9 pounds, 14 ounces. And if you've ever wondered why the average weight of a human baby is somewhere between 7 and 9 pounds, somewhere in there, right? Here's why. Because when you have babies that are anywhere from 3 pounds, 4 pounds, in this range here, babies with low birth weight, they are subject to more complications, and they most of the time do not live, which means those alleles don't get passed on. And on the other side, where you have babies who are 10 pounds, 11 pounds, 12 pounds, babies with this really high birth weight, they are also subject to more complications because it is difficult for them to actually be birthed. So both mother and baby can die. And again, without intervention, these alleles don't get passed on. And so this is why most human babies are within this birth weight range of anywhere from, say, 6 to 9 on average. Okay. So super interesting that even ourselves have been subject to these stabilizing selection pressures. But of course, that's going to change as technology changes and we intervene in that process more, right? So more babies that are born, 3, 4 pounds will begin to survive, which means there will be more babies born at 3, 4 pounds, which means more intervention will be needed. Same thing, babies that are 10 pounds to say 11 and a half, 12 pounds, definitely C-section range. That means more C-sections are going to be needed as those individuals go on to have more individuals. So you have to kind of prepare for that. When we start to intervene, we have to prepare to potentially have to continue to intervene unless we make some sort of change, right, to what we do. And it's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You just have to realize what's happening and what we're doing, right? But there's something called disruptive selection as well. And here's how that works. So disruptive selection is actually kind of funny, actually. So here we've got this population of individuals. These are the salmon. This is the relative size of male coho salmon that we're looking at. And here we've got the smaller male coho salmon. And here on the X we've got the larger male coho salmon. Now, here we go. So it turns out that the medium size male coho salmon usually get out competed for territory by the larger fish, right? And the smaller fish are actually able to sneak in and fertilize the eggs before being detected. So we end up with a population in the end overall where male coho salmon are either small or they're really large. And that's because the medium size just gets out-competed by these two. Okay. And so the next question is, well, is there natural selection for complex traits like behavior, intelligence, etc.? Well, in other organisms, there are. So here is a study that was done with rats, and here's the average on our Y, the average number of errors that were committed by the rat in a maze, and these are the different generations, right, on the X. So here's what they did. They used natural selection to try to produce and alter complex trait in behavior. So they took these slow learning rats, rats that were making errors in the maze. They were selected for, and then the slow learning rats were bred with each other. And that's in this sort of greenish color. And over time, we can see that over generations, as the generations increase and the number of errors that these rats' offsprings made increased, okay? And then they took the rats that were fast learners and they selectively bred them. And again, over time, the number of errors of the fast learners that were selectively bred for began to decrease. They became better at the maze. And so after 6 generations of selection, the rats selected for fast learning made only half as many errors as the slow learning rats. So it turns out that you can do that in rats. Not so much in humans, right? If you take a look at, if I were to ask you, what did Einstein's son, what is he known for? And Most of you would probably say, yeah, I don't know, or I don't think he's known for anything, right? And Einstein married, he married several times, but he married another scientist, and none of his children went on to make the same great discoveries that he has done. And so in humans, intelligence really is not this linear breed together, get a super intelligent human. Um, but turns out you can do it in rats. Okay. All right, let's carry on. So, natural selection can also co opt traits for new functions. So, this is really cool. Let's look at how that works. So, traits selected for one function can be co opted by natural selection for an entirely new function. So, we can see that here when we take a look at these insects. And here we have temperature. So, this is the thermoregulatory benefit, right? And we're looking at the insect, and they have these tiny little wing nub that are sometimes they can be used for thermoregulatory benefit. And so natural selection starts to select for insects that have these larger wing nubs, right? Because they actually do better when it's hot. But it turns out that the bigger the wing nubs get, then suddenly these wing nubs reach this intermediate size, and there begins to be some aerodynamic benefit. Like suddenly they can use their wing nubs, they're so big now, they can use it to fly, right? And so now natural selection begins to increase the size even further because they can now get away from their predators because they can fly. But that's not how the actual allele was originally selected for. It was selected because of its thermoregulatory benefit, but it ended up having this other new function that had an even further benefit. So that can happen as well. All right, I like this image because it shows this little guy right here. If you didn't spot him in there, little seahorse that is very well camouflaged amongst the corals here. All right, so fossils are huge when it comes to science because, number one, as you can see, it showed us that extinction does happen. And we learn a lot from fossils, and so we're constantly finding new fossils that is constantly changing the way we think about not only the present but also the past. And so here we have this fossilized remain of this Archaeopteryx, which shows this transitional form between modern birds and reptiles. And the wings and the feathers and the wishbone, which is the clavicle, are all features of modern birds. And this finding, this fossil, actually changed the category for birds, and birds were actually recategorized and placed under reptiles because of this fossil finding. And this was fairly recently. But let's take a look at some similarities, because this is what fossils help us in skeletons, help us to try to understand, right? Why we have what's called homologous structures, why we start to see the same structures showing up in other organisms. So here in our arm, we've got this humerus, which is the bone here, which is where your bicep and your triceps are. And then we've got our radius and our ulna, which is the forearm. And then we've got the phalanges here, which are your fingers. And then we've got the metacarpals and the carpals. Well, we've got the same bones in a horse. They have a humerus, they have a radius and an ulna, they have phalanges, they happen to walk on their phalanges, that is the hoof, right? We see the same thing in bats. They have a humerus, they have a radius and an ulna, they have phalanges. Same thing here with the dolphin. They have a humerus, they have a radius and an ulna, phalanges, carpus, metacarpus. And so these similarities in the bone structure of the forelimbs of animals can demonstrate to us that somehow there is some common ancestry there, that somehow we're seeing the same bones and we're seeing what's called homologous bone structure. And so now we're trying to put organisms into categories that we can understand. And they can be placed into different categories based on different things. So we can place them into categories based on homologous bone structure. We can place them into categories based on what we see phenotypically, right? But now we can also place them into categories based on their genotypes and what we're seeing in the genome. All right. I like to show this little guy because this is the vampire bat hard at work. This little bat creeps up in the middle of the night and sneaks up to sleeping, usually barn animals, cows and sheep that are sleeping, and they have these two front teeth that are very pointy, and they scrape away some skin, and their saliva has anticoagulant in it. And so the blood starts dripping and it keeps running because of the anticoagulant in their saliva. And so they basically drink blood. That is their protein meal. That's what they eat to survive. And they're called vampire bats. So there's something called convergent evolution, and you need to understand what that is. So convergent evolution basically is you can have these different starting materials, but they come to perform the same function. So for example, when we look at this dragonfly, we can see that for the wing, totally different starting material as what we have that's forming the wing for the bat. However, they both can fly, right? Convergent evolution leading to flight. Let's take a look at the evolution of antibiotic resistance, because this is the bane of our existence as humans as we battle microbes and viruses and things like that. But let's look at bacteria in particular. So here we have time on our y-axis, and time basically is going down here. So antibiotic resistance has evolved in Staphylococcus aureus. This is a strain of bacteria that is known to cause illness in humans, and it is found in hospitals. It's found outside in the ambient environment as well. It's called staph, right? So in the 1940s, when penicillin was first discovered and used, it was uniformly effective in killing the bacterium Staph aureus. As we can see here, we've got this little disc of penicillin, the antibiotic, and it's on a petri dish filled with staph, and we can see we've got this kill zone, and we can see that it killed very well, right? That was in the 1940s. However, as time marched on, we can see that the kill zone was getting smaller and smaller, and today, because of natural selection, it's led to an increase in antibiotic resistant alleles in Staph aureus, and humans are increasingly at risk for untreatable Staphylococcus infections. And as we can see, there is no kill zone. So very little of the staph is killed. Penicillin does not work. And now we have, you probably have heard of it, it's called MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which means it's a staph that we don't have antibiotics to kill. And that's bad. So we have to be very careful when we are using antibiotics that we're not selecting for bacteria to be resistant, and our antibiotics no longer work, because that is a very dangerous thing. When antibiotics no longer work, we can no longer save lives. Okay. We're going to move on to behavior, and then we're going to end up with that. So here we've got some wolves baying at the moon, and here we've got this little monkey, which has learned to hang on to the tree, dip down and get some water rather than coming to the banks of the river where the crocodiles will jump out and eat him. This way he can spring right back up with getting his water. And it turns out that this behavior can be passed on to other members of their monkey group, and it of course confers this survival benefit, because you're no longer as easily eaten by crocodiles when you have these newly learned behaviors. Well, It turns out that behaviors for us also can be beneficial, and here we see human children at play. And it turns out that play is extremely important for children. They're learning not only how to um, interact with each other, right? But also they're learning about their environment as they play. And so play is extremely important. So again, with behavior, here we can see this crab has evolved this energy efficient feeding behavior. And so these shore crabs, they feed on mussels, but they have this preference to choose mussels that provide the most energy relative to the effort it takes to open the shell. So they're going to choose the largest mussel, right? But it turns out that we too have evolved to prefer certain foods, right? That again confer the most energy for the effort involved to obtain them. So these are high fat and high sugar foods. And that explains why when someone says ice cream, we all come running, right? We all kind of get excited. And if you're a little kid, you really kind of lose your mind over some ice cream, right? But we all have that tendency. And that's because it has high fats, high sugars, high calorie pump, and we have evolved and adapted to actually want that. Because when we source food, we're looking for the food that's going to give us the most survival benefit, right? Even though that may not be something that is so important in this day and age where food is, so relatively abundant, right? But we still have that adaptation. And so here in controlled experiments, humans exhibit this preference for sugary foods and foods that are high in fat, but it turns out that the more fat, the stronger the preference. So here we have sugar content in this tealish color, and we have fat content in this yellowish color. And there comes a point where it can be too much sugar. And we're like, yes, we want it. And then you can have a height of sugar that we prefer. And if you get too much of that, then we start to actually not want it as much, right? But we don't really hit that point when it comes to fat. We will just straight up eat a piece of fat. And you can see that in this curve that there really is no point where we will turn it down. We will just eat straight fat. And that's because we've evolved to get the most calorie pump out of the food possible, because we evolved as a species that was walking the planet most of the day. Most of our day hours were spent up and about, either hunting and gathering for food, or outsourcing food, expending energy. And so you wanted to find food that gave you the most energy pump. And of course, today, completely different. Most of our time is spent in a sedentary state, yet we still crave these high fat and high sugar foods, so we have to be careful, right? But when it comes to animal species, some behaviors are what's called innate, right? So here we've got a mother geese. This is a very classic experiment. We have a mother geese, and with the sight of an egg outside of her nest, it's going to trigger this reflex action where she will go and do the side-to-side movement to gather in the egg back into her nest if it should roll out, okay? And so the first thing that we think as humans is, oh, she really loves that egg. Look, she came out of the nest. She scoops it back in with such care, right? But it turns out she would do that same behavior if you put a rock outside the nest, if you put a tin can outside the nest, that it's actually a fixed action that she is exhibiting, and it doesn't have to do with maternal care. It's a fixed action. So anything that even closely resembles an egg, even though a tin can really doesn't, it's round, I suppose, sort of, she will still bring it into the nest. And it doesn't have anything to do with the emotions of the egg. And so we have to be very careful because there are such things as fixed action patterns that animals and different organisms can exhibit. Okay, So by setting up these situations that would never occur in nature, then we can reveal when an animal is following these very simple innate behavioral rules, right? Rather than rules governed by some sort of emotion. But here's something that's very interesting. And if you can figure this out, then, please share it with the world. So here we have this monkey, and this monkey has no fear of a snake, right? So it's never seen a snake, doesn't know anything about a snake. What is a snake? Don't know. You can put this plastic snake here, and here's the monkey's food. And before exposure to fear of snakes, this monkey would very quickly just reach right over the snake to get the food, right? But now if you were to take this same monkey and give it a fear of snakes by exposing it either to a snake in real life, right? And basically it sees the snake bite another monkey and the monkey screams out in pain and gets sick and dies, then forever that monkey will be afraid of snakes. Or you show that monkey a video of another monkey being bitten by a snake and all these horrible things happen, that monkey will now have a fear of snakes. And if you were to take that same monkey, put a snake between the monkey and the food, there is no way that monkey is going to reach over the snake to get the food. So after exposure to this fear of snakes, then the monkey quickly learns to fear the snakes if it sees another monkey and, express that fear or is exposed to it at all, right? However, which makes sense, right? However, how many times have we as humans been exposed to guns, shooting people, causing death, all kinds of badness related to guns, and yet if we were to put a gun down in front of anyone, they would still reach for it to check it out. So somehow we do not have this same prepared learning as the monkey has, to have the fear of something that we've seen cause danger and harm when it comes to some metal object such as a gun. All right, that's prepared learning. Let's talk about kin selection. What is that? So here we've got this little squirrel. It's a female Belding ground squirrel. And at great risk to herself, this Belding ground squirrel will call out when she sees a predator, a hawk. She will stand on top of the mound and call out to the rest of the ground squirrels, "Hey, there's a hawk, everyone run." Now this puts her in danger because she's standing on top of a mound, screaming out for the hawk to basically zero in to come and get her as everyone else is scrambling for cover. And it turns out that 80% of squirrels making the alarm calls are older females, and they have more relatives in a colony than the males and young females. And so making this alarm call would seem like a bad idea, but because the call protects many of her relatives, then the alarm calling behavior is favored by natural selection. So we would think, okay, what happens if we transplant a female Belding ground squirrel that is not related to the squirrel colony? So researchers transplanted this older female Belding ground squirrel to a new colony. She has no relatives there, but she still made the alarm call, revealing that animals may sometimes follow these simple behavioral rules. And so now this transplanted ground squirrel, not related to any other individuals in the colony, is still going to stand on the mound, call out, "Hey, there's a predator, everybody run," even though she's not related to those in the colony. So it really has nothing to do with being related to those in the colony. Okay, it is a simple behavioral rule. But there are rules that animals must follow in a social setting. So, for example, remember that vampire bat that I showed you earlier? So here, this is an example of reciprocal altruism in vampire bats. So a vampire bat may vomit up a blood meal for an unrelated individual, saving that individual's life. So they fly back to the cave. One individual didn't find anything to creep up on and eat. It's going to starve to death because it didn't eat that night. However, it can, ask another bat next to it whether or not it could vomit up a blood meal and share that meal. And turns out that bats will only do this for individuals that will return the favor, so that their own survival is improved in the long run and the behavior is favored by natural selection. So if there's a bat that's just like, yeah, no, I'm not trying to help you tonight, then the next time that same situation happens to that bat, then that bat will starve to death and basically not make it to go on to produce other bats that are selfish, right? So this is reciprocal altruism, helping the other individual. And it turns out that we are motivated by the same thing, by this reciprocal altruism. So we can see this in social media. So we can see here we keep track of friends, right? How many friends do I have? Do I have a lot of friends? Do I have a few friends, right? And this importance of record keeping, keeping track of cheaters and identifying good potential reciprocity partners, i.e. other cooperators, maybe why humans are so interested in social information and seemingly trivial gossip, why we want to keep going back to social media to see who's there, what is everyone saying, are people giving me likes. This is why we're so motivated by that, right? This concept of reciprocal altruism, right? All right, here's a question for you. Would you choose success of the group or your own individual success? Which would you choose? And the question, the answer might be surprising. So take a look at this. When we look at the question, does group selection occur? So group selection describes the evolution of a trait that is beneficial for the species or the population while decreasing the fitness of the individual exhibiting the trait. Okay, let's take a look at that. So here we have this proportion of selfless behavior alleles in the population, right, in this greenish color. We start off with these selfless individuals. I'm going to do what's best for the group, even though it reduces your own reproductive output, right? So for those of you who said, I'm going to choose the group over me, right? And then we have this in teal, this proportion of selfish behavior allele in the population, which is do the best for you, even if it hurts the group, right? Well, it turns out over time, because this selfless group is who's always choosing to do what's best for the group, even though it lowers your own reproductive success, well, suddenly that allele starts to get eliminated, right? Because they were always choosing to do what's best for the group, and their reproductive success was going down. And suddenly now we start to see fixation. Remember that word, that term? Fixation of the selfish behavior allele in the population. So regardless of the initial frequencies over time, selfish behavior alleles increase their market share relative to alleles for selfless behavior. And because group selection decreases the reproductive success of individuals, it actually very rarely occurs. Okay, so this explains why most people tend to be selfish. In the end, like when it really boils down to it, most people will tend to be selfish, right? And not do what's best for the group, but tend to want to do what's best for them. Okay, so that makes it a little easier to take when people do things like that kind of tick you off. All right, let's take a look at some behavioral output when it comes to reproductive. So when we take a look at fruit flies, so males may increase reproductive success by mating with as many females as possible. Okay. However, females' reproductive success is not generally increased by seeking additional mating opportunities, because it doesn't matter how many number of mates they have, they're still going to have the same number of offspring. So doesn't make it beneficial for females to mate with a number of different males, right? But when it comes to males, the more mates that they have, of course, the more offspring that is going to result. And so mating with additional females increases reproductive success for males. So males are going to tend to want to mate with more females, and females are going to tend to want to mate with only a few males, all right? But it's not the same for all organisms. That was fruit flies. When we look at bush crickets, when the bush crickets mate, the male loses about a quarter of his body weight, contributing to this massive ejaculate that the female uses for energy. And this makes males more choosy as to who they are going to mate with. Okay. Some factors that come about in mate selection. We've got courtship rituals. Here we've got a female grebe requiring the male to perform this courtship dance before she'll mate with him. We have gifts up front. A female hanging fly will not mate with a male unless he brings her a large offering of food. That's this one right here. The pictures are kind of switched. And then we have control of valuable resources. So we've got right here, female yellow-bellied marmots, which is this animal, prefer rock outcroppings that provide retreats for escape from predators and for hibernation. And these rock outcroppings are controlled by dominant males. So that's one of the factors in mate selection. And of course, good looks. Here we've got female peacock is attracted to a male with the most beautiful tail feathers. Okay. So we can go on and talk about polygamy and elephant seal. So in a polygamous mating system, some individuals have multiple mates while others have few or none. So here we have the dominant elephant seal. We can see all of his offspring. Here we have the low-ranking male elephant seals. They're not getting to breed. Maybe this guy snuck in and he's got one offspring, right? So in an extremely polygamous mating system, such as in elephant seals, the vast majority of males have no reproductive success at all. It is mostly the dominant male. When we look at monogamous birds, for example, there are approximately, say, 10,000 species of birds that we know of on the planet, and more than 90% of them appear to be monogamous. There is something called sexual dimorphism, and what this is with sexual dimorphism, the sexes differ in size or appearance. So here we have the male elephant seal. You can see that he is much larger than the female. He's got this huge proboscis, this huge nose, right? And so there are certain behaviors that we see with species that have sexual dimorphism. They look different. Males and females look different. One is one parent invests more in caring for the offspring. The mating system tends towards polygamy. One sex, usually females, is choosier when selecting a mate, and one sex, usually males, competes for access to mating opportunities with the other sex. So that is sexual dimorphism. However, in birds, they have sexual monomorphism, which means when you look at these two birds, you are hard-pressed to tell who is male and who is female. And generally, you have to do laparoscopy in order to determine which is which. So there's no visual clues as to which is male and which is female here, and that's called sexual monomorphism. And so there are behaviors that are associated with sexual monomorphism. Both parents invest approximately equal time in caring for the offspring. The mating system tends towards monogamy, and both sexes are equally choosy when selecting a mate. We're continuing on, finishing up behavior. So there are different forms of animal communication that you need to be aware of. So there's chemical communication. So these are pheromones that are released by one individual and detected by another using antenna, for example. And these pheromones can, these chemical communication methods can trigger behavioral responses. There's auditory communication. The sounds, such as the roar of a lion, are a common method of triggering behavioral responses. We've got visual communication here. We've got this puffer fish that just puffs up, right? They can convey information such as threat or receptivity with visual displays. Here, the balloonfish puffs up its body in response to a predator. These are highly, highly toxic, by the way. The liver of this pufferfish is one of the most deadly toxins on the planet. If you so much as, put even just a drop or a piece of it on your tongue, you will probably drop dead very quickly. So highly, highly toxic. And, we have to be careful because sometimes we can misunderstand the cues of another organism. And so that's why there are behavioral specialists. So when we take a look at this animal here, this monkey, and he's doing this, and we see these huge teeth, and of course we're like, whoa, okay, that's very scary, right? Apparently he's threatening me. But it turns out when monkeys do this grimace, it's called a grimace, we call it a smile, right? You think, oh, look, he's being so sweet. Look, he's smiling at me. But it turns out that monkey, the grimace in translation in monkey language is, don't hurt me. I'm afraid of you. Don't hurt me. And so, they can have different meanings in different species, right? There are complex forms of communication in the animal organism, or the animal world. Here we have the honeybee waggle dance, which before we thought, oh, they're just basically kind of wagging that they found something. Well, it turns out they're actually giving the GPS coordinates of exactly where the flowers and the pollen source is, which is incredible. It's conveying latitude and longitude coordinates to the other bees, which we didn't know before. So very complex. And, we're doing the same thing. We have these humans are displaying these complex forms of communication, which we can read, right? When we look at these different children, I mean, you can make different interpretations as to what you think they are actually feeling. So when you look at this little individual, you may think that he is very engaged in what the teacher is saying. That when you look at this little guy, it looks like he might be kind of doing something over with the books, that he's got a little sneaky kind of look on his face, right? And this little one, she looks very amused, right? So we are always making interpretations as to what we feel another human is communicating with their body language. But here we've got what's called an honest signal, and this is a frog, and the volume of this male natterjack toad's call affects females' mating decisions, for example, because it's an honest signal. And that's because loud calls can only be made by large males. Smaller males can't fake it. So it's an honest signal carrying accurate information. So that's what an honest signal is. All right, so I want to wrap up with probably explaining to you one of the most important things that I can get you to sort of uncover and understand. And these are some of the adaptations that we have as humans that strongly motivate us today. So when we think about the human species, let's take a look at a map. So when we look at this map of human migration, and this is traced back by looking at the genome of humans that have been analyzed throughout, the planet and the fossil record, what we see is that all of our genomic material goes back to Africa, no matter where you think you are from. Everyone actually started here. And we know that the human species, and that is Homo sapiens that we're talking about, because that's the human species that is alive today. We're all Homo sapiens. The human species picked up and left Africa and basically traveled around the world, right? We populated the whole world, just picked up and started walking across all the different land masses that were connected way back when. But we all related, we all come from this one, very large group in Africa that picked up and began to populate the world. Now, here's something interesting. When you look at some of the motivations of those first people that we're all descended from, that picked up and left Africa to travel, populate the world, they had to have curiosity, right? Extremely curious. What's on the other side? I want to go see it. They had to want to travel, right? That wasn't, something they didn't want to do. They really wanted to go over there, right? They had to have this lack of distant fear, because there was a group that stayed behind, right? Not all the Homo sapiens at that time packed up and went for a walk. Some of them stayed behind. And so you would have to think that, possibly those who stayed behind would have said, aren't you afraid of what's on the other side of that mountain that you can't see? Well, that group had to basically say, no, I'm not afraid. I'm going to go because I am very curious and I want to go see. But they also had to store and collect, right? They had to have this need to store and collect because, as you can imagine, food is few and far between. And so when you found things that would be useful, you want to store and collect it. And then another motivator for them would be scarcity. This thought that, when I get to the other side, there may not be these berries that I like, or this food that I like, or, something that they need. So scarcity was a huge driver. This tribal affinity, like I want to stay with the group of humans that's, that I am off, traveling with, right? So there was tribal affinity there. This need to conquer. When they got to the other side, it turns out that we now know that there was another group of humans that were alive at the time who are now extinct, and that is Homo neanderthalis. And so when Homo sapiens packed up and left and began to travel the world, they came across Homo neanderthalis. And we know that because there are some people who still carry Neanderthal genes, right? Not 100% because Neanderthals are extinct, but they still have some genes of Neanderthals in them. So we know that there was basically cross mating going on between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. What we don't know is why Homo neanderthalis is extinct. What happened? Why are they extinct? Did we cause it? What was it? We don't know, right? And that is sort of the huge question of our time, because the thing that we have to be worried about is, whatever caused them to go extinct, we, survived it, but maybe some variation of that may, come to us. And if we don't know what that is, that leaves us vulnerable. So we're always trying to, from the fossil record and from everything that we find, and this is why archaeology is so important. We're always trying to figure out what happened to people of the past, right? But there was a lot of conquering going on, and we know that because of this tribal affinity, right? And this need to explore. But I want you to look at these different traits, and I want you to see how much we're still motivated by these traits today. So curiosity, huge motivator. When we look at marketing, marketers know this very, very well. They use all of these traits to trigger us to buy the things that they want us to buy. And so what they'll do is, for example, if because of this travel motivation, if someone were to offer you some plane tickets to XYZ, you would jump on it, right? This lack of distant fear, this is one of the traits. This lack of distant fear is one of these traits that actually is harmful for us. This is one of the traits that actually is kind of playing against us in the global warming sphere, because it seems so far away that, you know, catastrophic things will be happening, that we tend to really think that it's not a problem, even though it's a huge problem, right? But this lack of distant fear is a trait that we have. The need to store and collect. I mean, look at how many storage facilities there are, right? We store and collect beyond storing and collecting. Excitement, fear, huge motivator, right? Scarcity. You'll see that many times when you go to any website or even watch television. They're like, this is a limited time offer. It will expire in, you know, 2 days or 1 day. They're creating scarcity because it's a very strong motivator for us to do the thing that they're asking us to do, because if not, scarcity, right? So I want you to really think about these human motivations. There's some links here that relate to some other work that's being done in the field, looking at modern day motivations. Wikipedia has a really huge site on the different theories and hypotheses regarding motivation, if you're interested in that. And that is going to end this lecture on evolution, natural selection, and behavior. That's it. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.